The week after Dominic told me to hide my friends somewhere, I found his article in the quarterly journal and read it twice. Then I walked to my study, pulled a specific book from the bottom shelf, the one I'd cataloged myself 31 years ago with my own handwriting on the spine label, and I sat down with both of them on my lap. I read them side by side for about 40 minutes. Then I made a cup of tea, brought it back to the chair, and sat very still for a while longer. The tea went cold. I didn't drink it. I just looked at the window and thought about what a person does when they know something that could destroy their child, and when they decide to know it quietly, and for how long. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's how these things tend to go. You arrive at the worst moment first, and then you have to walk backward to explain how a person ended up there, sitting in a wingback chair with cold tea and a very specific kind of grief. Let me go back to a Tuesday in October, which was the evening Dominic first used the word embarrassing, and which was the evening I began, without entirely meaning to remember everything. I had lived in my house on Fenwick Street for 22 years. It was a narrow Victorian row house with original plaster medallions on the ceiling and a kitchen extension I'd added after Gerald died, because grief makes some people drink and makes other people gut their kitchens and install a proper island. The island had been worth it. There was room for 6 people around it comfortably, and on alternate Tuesday evenings, there were exactly 5 women seated at it, plus me, which was the right number. We called ourselves the Marginalia Club, though the name had evolved over the years from something more earnest that none of us liked to repeat. We had started, 12 years earlier, as a straightforward book club. We had become, over time, something harder to categorize. We read serious books, mostly nonfiction, the kind with bibliographies, and we talked about them with the focused, digressive pleasure of people who had spent their careers thinking professionally and now thought for the sheer joy of it. We also argued, gossiped, laughed too loudly, occasionally cried, and once, memorably, stayed until 2 a.m. debating a single footnote in a biography of Louis Kahn. It had been Nora's footnote. It had been a very good footnote. That Tuesday, I had been halfway through setting out wine glasses when I heard Dominic's key in the door. He was not expected. He had a key from years ago, from the years when he still used it regularly, which had become less frequent as his career became more demanding and his social life more curated. He came in already talking, pulling off his coat, and there was a man behind him I didn't recognize. Tall, early 40s, wearing a jacket that had been expensive enough to still look expensive after a few years. Dominic introduced him as Fletcher Hale. Fletcher Hale, I gathered from the introduction, was the managing director of the publishing group that had just absorbed the quarterly journal where Dominic served as lead critic. He was, in other words, Dominic's new boss, or the person deciding whether to formalize that arrangement. My friends were already settled. Becca Holloway was at the island with a glass of red wine and a hardcover book open beside her, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, talking to Sylvia Crane about something that involved animated hand gestures. Dot Faber was at the table in the corner, which she preferred, her old canvas bag open and a manila envelope on the table that almost certainly contained photographs, because Dot's bags always contained photographs, the way other people's bags contained receipts or lip balm. Nora Chu was standing at the kitchen window looking at the garden with the focused expression of someone composing an argument. Sylvia was Sylvia, which is to say she was sitting very straight and saying very little and missing nothing. The introductions were performed. My friends were gracious, as they always were. Becca said something warm and slightly irreverent that made Fletcher Hale laugh. Dot looked at him from the corner with quiet, assessing eyes, and then went back to her envelope. Nora turned from the window and shook his hand and said she had read something of his about adaptive reuse in Bristol and found it interesting, which was Nora's version of a compliment. Dominic stood in the middle of all of it with the expression I had been noticing for a few years. A particular tightening around the jaw, a slight narrowing of focus that I had come to associate with the feeling of being slightly misplaced in a room. They didn't stay. Dominic had wanted to pick up a file he'd left in the study on a previous visit, and after 10 minutes of pleasant enough conversation about nothing consequential, he and Fletcher moved toward the hallway. I walked them out. At the door, after Fletcher stepped ahead to the car, Dominic turned back. "The article I mentioned at the journal dinner? I'm thinking of submitting it for the Harwick shortlist next month. Fletcher's been supportive." "That's wonderful," I said. I meant it then. "Which article?" "The Vanek piece, the rediscovery. It's been getting real attention." I had read the Vanek piece. I said something appropriate and watched him walk to the car. I closed the door. I went back to the kitchen where my friends had smoothly resumed the evening as if nothing had interrupted it. Because that is one of the things long friendship makes possible. The ability to read a room and give someone space to return to it. Later, after the wine was almost gone and Nora had made her point about the footnote in whatever we were reading that month, Dominic texted me. I read it at the island with the others around me. "Ma'am, can I say something? I know they're your friends, and I respect that. But when my people come over, colleagues, professional contacts, could you maybe keep the club somewhere else? Just on those evenings. It's a little, I don't know. It feels like it complicates the impression. You understand." I set the phone face down on the island. I picked up my wine glass. Becca was telling a story about a terrible restaurant in Lisbon, and everyone was laughing. I laughed too, because the story was genuinely funny, and because there was no reason to ruin a Tuesday evening over something I was still deciding what to do with. But I kept the text. I kept it because it told me something important. That my son had looked at the 5 women around my kitchen island, a former editor, a retired copyright lawyer, a documentary photographer with 4 decades of archives, a professor of architectural history, and a former head librarian, and seen only furniture that didn't match. I thought about that for a while before I let myself think about the other thing. The other thing had begun 3 weeks earlier when Nora had called me on a Sunday afternoon. Nora called on Sunday afternoons when she had something to say that she didn't want to say in a group. She is like that, economical with information, careful about audience. She had asked me if I had read Dominic's Vanek piece, and I said, not yet. And she had been quiet for a moment and then said, carefully, that I might want to. I read it that evening. It was excellent. That was the problem. It was excellent in a very specific way. The argument was original, the interpretation was precise. The framework for reassessing the career of Josef Vanek, a mid-century Hungarian architect who had built 3 remarkable housing projects in Budapest before disappearing into administrative obscurity after 1968, was genuinely illuminating. Dominic wrote well. I had always known that. But reading it, I felt a sensation I hadn't felt since my working years. The particular unease of a trained cataloger who recognizes something but can't immediately place the source. The next morning, I went to the study. I had worked in the university library's special collections for 26 years, and the habits of that work had never entirely left me. I kept a section of shelving for books that had passed through my hands professionally. Not valuable, not rare, just the ones that had stayed with me. The one I was looking for was thin, about 90 pages, published by a small Hungarian cultural press with a London distribution agreement that had lasted approximately 2 years. The Invisible Architecture of Joseph Vanek. Author, Erzsébet Takács, architectural historian, published 1987. I had cataloged it in 1993, 10 years after it arrived in the library, when we were doing a retroactive classification project. My handwriting was on the spine label, small, neat, black ink. I sat down with Dominic's article and the Takács monograph, and I read them side by side for 40 minutes. The cold tea happened. Then I sat in the chair for a long time. The argument in the article was not identical to the monograph. Dominic had done real work. There was additional research, updated sourcing, new interviews with surviving colleagues of Vanek's. But the framework, the specific interpretation of the 1963 Újpest housing block as a deliberate subversion of socialist realist doctrine rather than compliance with it. The reading of the circulation patterns as a coded assertion of individual spatial autonomy. The particular three-part analytical structure, concealment, then emergence, then silence. These were not developments of the Takács thesis. They were the Takács thesis, moved to a new address. I called Nora back that evening. "You've read it." "I've read it," I said. "And the Takács." "Yes." A pause on the line, the sound of Nora setting down a cup somewhere. "She's still alive. Erzsébet Takács. She must be in her late 70s. I looked her up. She's in Budapest. She has a daughter." I had not looked that far yet. I sat with that for a moment. "He didn't cite it," I said. "No." "Do you think he found it himself, or—" "Margaret." Nora's voice was gentle but direct, the way it was when she was about to say something she had thought through. That monograph had a print run of 400 copies. It was distributed in English-speaking countries for about 2 years before the press closed. There are perhaps 30 copies in British institutional libraries. You have one. I know of one at LSE. It is not impossible that he found it, but it's improbable that he found it and then chose not to cite it. I didn't say anything. "The Harwick shortlist," Nora said. "That's significant." "I know." "Margaret, what do you want to do?" I didn't know yet. That was what I said, and it was true. What I did know was that I needed to think, and that I needed to think quietly, and that I should not say anything to Dominic until I knew exactly what I was saying and exactly what I wanted to happen at the end of it. I want to be clear about something. I am not a person who moves quickly in a crisis. I was a librarian. I know that information changes in the handling, and that the worst mistakes come from acting on partial knowledge. I also know that there is a particular kind of love that requires you to see your child clearly, not as you wish them to be, and to act on what you see, not to punish them, but because anything else is a different kind of abandonment. I had been a good mother, I thought. I had not always been a comfortable one. Gerald used to say I loved Dominic like a cataloger, precisely, with full attention to detail. He meant it as a compliment. For 3 days, I didn't call Dominic. I didn't mention it to the others. I thought about the Harwick shortlist, which had a ceremony in 3 weeks. I thought about what would happen if Erzsébet Takács's daughter had already noticed, which Nora had implied was possible. I thought about what it would mean for the article to be formally flagged after the shortlist rather than before. The distinction mattered enormously. A retraction and apology before a public recognition was recoverable. A scandal at or after the ceremony was not. On the 4th day, I called Becca Holloway. Becca answered on the 2nd ring, which she always did, and immediately said she was in the middle of something interesting. "What are you in the middle of?" I said. I'm looking at a photograph Dot sent me. You'll want to see it. Are you free Saturday? Becca, I need to ask you something. Something in my voice must have carried through because she was quiet for a moment. I heard the sound of her sitting down. Tell me, she said. I told her about the article, about the Takach monograph, about Nora's call. I read her two parallel passages, one from the article, one from the book. And when I finished, there was a long silence on Becca's end. Margaret, I know. I edited that journal, you know, Built Form, 1989 to 2009. I know you did. In 1987, 2 years before I took over, they rejected a submission. She paused. I have the archive files. I kept everything when I left. The outgoing editor was meticulous. He kept copies of everything, rejections included. It was a legal habit. I went very still. A submission. A piece on Vanek, submitted by an Erzsébet Takach. They rejected it because the editor at the time found the theoretical framework too, what was the word? Too speculative. A short, dry laugh. It was 1987. Speculative was a dirty word. The irony being that the framework was exactly right. Becca, I have the rejection letter with the original submission attached. It's in a box in my spare room with 40 years of other things I should have organized. But it's there, and it's dated. We didn't say anything for a moment. Outside my window, the October garden was gray and wet and very still. I'll find it this week, Becca said. Extraordinary. I thanked her and hung up. I sat very still for a while again. Then I called Sylvia Crane. Sylvia listened without interrupting, which was her way. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly the right amount of time and then said, What outcome do you want? I want Erzsébet Takach to have her work attributed correctly. I want Dominic to have the opportunity to do that himself, publicly, before someone else does it to him. I want him to keep his career if that's possible. And I want him to understand exactly who made that possible. The last part isn't a legal matter, Sylvia said. No. The rest of it is manageable. If Takach's daughter has already made contact with the journal, the clock is ticking. Does Dominic know? I don't think so. He texted me this week about the shortlist as if everything was fine. Then he doesn't know yet. A pause. I'll make some calls. Quietly. I know someone at the Harwick panel. Not a conflict, just an acquaintance. And I'll want to see Becca's document. If the framework predates the article by 36 years and there's an archived submission with the same theoretical structure, that's a very complete picture. I thanked her and we hung up. I made a second cup of tea. This one I drank. I want to tell you about Saturday, because Saturday is when Dot came over, and Dot is the one I haven't described properly yet. Dot Faber had spent 40 years as a documentary photographer, newspapers, then magazines, then the long independent work she did in the last decade before her retirement, which had included a project on post-war housing in Central Europe. She had traveled throughout the former Eastern Bloc in the 1990s, documenting what was happening to the buildings, which ones were being torn down, which ones were surviving, which ones were being quietly celebrated by the people who lived in them. She had an archive, not a digital archive, an archive in the old sense, boxes, contact sheets, prints, cataloged by location and year. She came over on Saturday morning with the canvas bag and the manila envelope she'd had at the island on Tuesday. She spread photographs on my kitchen table, 8x10 black and white prints, the Újpest housing block from 1994, taken before the renovation, before anyone outside a small circle of Hungarian architectural historians had talked about Vanyek in English. The photographs were beautiful, More importantly, they were labeled. Dot labeled everything. On the back of each print, in pencil, location, date, and the name she had been given for the architect when she asked the building superintendent who had designed it. Vaniek, J., 1963. In pencil, in Dot's hand, in 1994. I took these for the housing project, Dot said, sitting across from me with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. I never published them. They didn't fit the editorial brief in the end, but I kept everything. I looked at the photographs for a long time. The circulation pattern was exactly as Dominic had described it in the article, exactly as Erzsébet Takács had described it in 1987. Dot, can I ask, did you ever read anything about these buildings? In the 1990s, I mean, academically. Dot thought about it. There was something, a small book, I think, Hungarian press. My Hungarian was poor, but someone translated parts of it for me. She frowned at her coffee. A woman's name. I can't remember now. Takács? She looked up. Possibly. Why? I told her. She listened in the way Dot listened to things, very quietly, with complete attention, her face almost still. When I finished, she picked up one of the photographs and looked at it. He wrote about these buildings. Yes. Without mentioning the book. Yes. She set the photograph down. I'll write down everything I remember about the translation, and you can have the photographs. That was Dot. That had always been Dot. By the following Tuesday, I had, assembled in a manila folder on my desk, Nora's notes on the Takács monograph and the parallel passages with page references, Becca's copy of the 1987 submission to Builtform with the rejection letter attached, Sylvia's preliminary assessment, 3 pages, typed, which included contact information for the daughter of Erzsébet Takács, Katalin Vaniek Takács, who had, as Sylvia's acquaintance on the Harwick panel had quietly confirmed, already sent a letter to the journal. It had arrived 4 days ago. The journal had not yet responded. The shortlist ceremony was in 17 days. I called Dominic. He answered with the warmth he used when he was in a good mood and had no particular reason to be cautious. That voice, the one I had loved since he was old enough to have a voice, a little lower than Gerald's had been, but with the same quality of light in it when things were going well. "Mom, how are you? I've been meaning to call." "Come for dinner on Thursday," I said. "Just us." "Of course. Everything okay?" "Everything is fine," I said. "I just want to see you." This was true. It remained true all the way to Thursday. I want to describe the Thursday dinner, but first I want to describe the 2 days before it because they matter. I did not sleep well on Wednesday night. This is not unusual for me. I have slept lightly since Gerald died, which is now 11 years ago, and the body makes its own accommodations. But Wednesday night was different. I lay in the dark, and I thought about Dominic at 8 years old, sitting on the floor of the study while I cataloged new acquisitions, asking me questions about every book he touched. About Dominic at 14, furious at a teacher who had given him a low mark on an essay that had been correct, coming to me with the essay in his hand, wanting me to confirm that he was right. About Dominic at 22, showing me the first piece he'd ever had published in a real journal, printed out, hands not quite steady. He had been so proud. He had been right to be proud. The piece had been genuinely his. That was what made Wednesday night difficult. Not the question of whether he had done something wrong. That was settled. The question was how it had happened. Had he read the Takács, absorbed it, and then genuinely not remembered the source? It was possible. It happened to scholars, more often than scholars like to admit. Or had he found it, seen its value, and made a choice? That was harder to sit with. I lay in the dark, and I didn't know. And I thought that perhaps only Dominic knew, and perhaps he'd tell me Thursday, and perhaps that would change what I felt about it, even if it didn't change what had to happen. I got up at 5 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Dot's photographs were still spread out. In the lamplight, the Ushpest housing block had a particular quality. The way the light came through the interior circulation space, diagonal and generous. You could see, even in a photograph from 30 years after construction, why Vanacek had made the choices he'd made. You could see the argument, built in concrete and glass, for a particular idea about how people deserved to move through the places where they lived. I sat with that for a while. Then I went to shower and dress, because there is always something clarifying about getting dressed for a day that matters. Thursday evening, I made the lamb stew that Dominic had liked since childhood, the one with the preserved lemon, not the standard version. I set the table properly. He arrived at 7, cheerful and a little distracted, with a good bottle of wine that he knew I'd appreciate, because he was thoughtful in those ways. He had always been thoughtful in those ways. We talked through the first course without incident. He told me about Fletcher Hale's plans for the journal, which were ambitious and seemed sound. He told me about a building he'd been to see in Manchester that had disappointed him. He asked about the garden, about the neighbors, about whether I'd been to any interesting exhibitions. He was present, warm, and completely unguarded. I waited until the wine was halfway gone. I got up and went to the study and came back with the manila folder. I set it on the table between us. He looked at it. Something changed in his face. Not guilt, not yet. Just the recognition that this was not a normal dinner gesture. He looked at me. What is this? Read the top document first. That's Nora's notes. She's marked the parallel passages. Then the second document. That's from Becca's archive. He opened the folder. He read. I watched him read. I have thought since then about what it looks like when a person reads something they hoped did not exist. It's not dramatic. It's very quiet. The face goes through several adjustments. The first one that looks like confusion, then the one that looks like recalculation, then the one that looks like a person trying to find the version of events that makes this better, and then, finally, the one where they stop finding it. He closed the folder. He put his hands flat on the table. He did not look at me. How long have you known? 3 weeks. A long pause. The kitchen was very quiet. The lamb stew had gone cold. Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you how it happened, I said. That's between you and yourself. What I'm going to tell you is what's going to happen next, and you need to listen carefully. He looked up then. His face was, I don't have a better word, diminished. Not the way guilt makes a person small, the way finding out something about yourself that you already knew somewhere makes you small. He had known. On some level, he had known. There's a letter at the journal from Erzsébet Takic's daughter. It arrived 4 days ago. Sylvia knows this. She has a contact on the Harwick panel. The journal hasn't responded yet. You have 17 days before the ceremony. If you contact the journal yourself, today, tomorrow, not Thursday of next week, and propose a correction, a co-credit, a formal acknowledgement, there is a version of this where your career survives. If you wait and the letter is acted on and it becomes a formal complaint, there is no version. He stared at me. How do you... Sylvia? Sylvia Crane? She's offered to help manage the communication. Becca has the original submission documentation, which establishes the prior date definitively. Nora can speak to the academic status of the Takic work and why it should have been cited. If you approach the journal with documentation already in hand, acknowledging the oversight, offering a correction, proposing to contact Erzsébet Takic directly and involve her work properly, that's a different conversation than if the journal has to come to you. You've been for 3 weeks. Yes. Did you think about just not telling me? Letting it happen? I looked at him for a moment. No. He was quiet for a long time. He picked up his wine glass and held it without drinking. The garden outside was dark, and the kitchen lamp made a small, warm circle around the table that felt, in that moment, like the only light in a considerable darkness. I read the book, he said, the Takach. I found it in a sale, a box of architectural books from an estate, 3 years ago. I read it and I thought, the argument is right. It's right and no one knows it, and it should be out there. And I started writing, and at some point the line between engaging with an argument and taking it, I told myself I was building on it. I told myself it was synthesis. He stopped. I didn't say anything. I don't know if I believed that. I think I might have believed it for a while. Dominic, I know. You need to contact the journal tomorrow morning. Not to explain, not to qualify, to take responsibility and to offer a path forward. That's all. He put down the wine glass. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture from childhood, from the nights before difficult exams, from the days after Gerald died. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that is the specific signature of loving someone who has done something you cannot undo for them. Will Sylvia help me draft the communication? He asked. His voice was steadier now, the voice of someone who had accepted a situation and was beginning to operate within it. She's expecting your call, I said. We sat for a while longer. I reheated the lamb stew and we ate it, and we did not talk about the article again that night. We talked about other things, easier things, old things. At one point he said, out of nowhere, that he remembered coming to the library as a child and sitting in the reading room while I worked, and that the smell of the old paper had always made him feel safe. I said I remembered. We left it there. He called Sylvia the next morning at 8. I know because Sylvia texted me 2 words at 8:15. He called. And then nothing more, because Sylvia does not provide running commentary. She handles things. The following 10 days were, for me, oddly quiet. The machinery was in motion, and it didn't require me. Dominic worked with Sylvia on the communication to the journal. Becca provided the documentation. Nora prepared a short written statement on the significance of the Takach work, which was included in the journal's preliminary response to Catalin Vanek Takach. Dot's photographs, 3 of them, the best ones, were reproduced with the corrected article when it ran with the amended attribution. She did not ask for payment. She said it was for the buildings. I want to tell you about the Marginalia Club meeting the week before the ceremony, because it was important in a way that had nothing to do with Dominic. It was at Nora's apartment. We rotated, and we were discussing a book about the ethics of architectural preservation. The coincidence was not lost on any of us. About an hour in, Becca refilled everyone's wine and said, with the particular dry warmth she deployed when she was going to say something real, warmly, with a touch of irony, "Do you know what's interesting about this week? None of us told our families what we were doing." "My son doesn't know," Sylvia confirmed. "My daughter thinks I've been doing the garden," said Nora. "I didn't tell anyone," Dot said simply. I looked around the table at these women I had known for 12 years, who had spent their working lives accumulating expertise that the world had noticed, and then, in the way it does, slowly stopped noticing once they were no longer attached to institutions, who showed up every other Tuesday and argued about footnotes and talked about everything and asked nothing of each other except attention and honesty. He texted me, I said, last month. He asked me to keep the club somewhere else when his people came over. A pause. Then Becca said, dry, savoring it, his people. His professional contacts. Nora set down her glass with a small, precise movement. Measured with an edge. That's unfortunate. I kept the text, I said. Everyone looked at me. I looked back at them. I'm not going to use it as a weapon, but I'm going to show it to him at the right moment. I just want him to see it in his own handwriting. Nobody argued with this. We went back to the book. The ceremony was not what I had expected. Dominic had, in the end, withdrawn the Vanek article from Harwick consideration himself. Quietly, with a note to the panel that simply stated the piece was undergoing revision. He had contacted Erzsébet Takács through her daughter. The first call had been difficult, Dominic told me later. She was 81, with a dry, precise voice and 40 years of patience about her work being overlooked. She had received his acknowledgement with grace and a certain wry humor that Dominic said had been harder to bear than anger. They had agreed to a revised version of the article, co-authored with Takács credited as the originator of the theoretical framework and Dominic credited for the additional research and updated sourcing. It was a better article. Everyone agreed it was a better article. The evening of the ceremony, which Dominic was still attending, not as a shortlisted candidate, but as a journal representative, he came to Fenwick Street first. I had not asked him to. He arrived at 6, before I was ready, and stood in the kitchen while I finished getting dressed. And when I came down, he was sitting at the island where my friends had been sitting when Fletcher Hale had come through that Tuesday in October. He had the manila folder in front of him. He had kept it, apparently. He looked at me when I came in, and then he looked at the island, and then back at me. I need to say something, he said. I waited. Quietly, with effort. The text I sent you, about keeping the club somewhere else, I've been thinking about it since Thursday. I kept it, I said. I showed him my phone. He read it on the screen, his own words, his own request, dated 3 weeks before his mother had quietly assembled the means of saving him from himself. He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he set the phone down. Your people. He half laughed without humor. Your embarrassing people. My people, I said. He was quiet for a while. I didn't know. I knew Becca had been in publishing. I knew Sylvia was a lawyer. I didn't think about... I just saw a group of old women at my mother's kitchen island, and I thought... You saw furniture that didn't match, I said. He looked up. That's exact. I know it is. I've been thinking about it for a month. He picked up the phone again, looked at the text again, put it down. They didn't have to help. No. They did it for you. They did it because it was the right thing to do, I said. And yes, because of me. Those aren't separate things. We drove to the ceremony together. He was quiet in the car for most of the way, and I let him be quiet, because some processing requires silence and motion and the passing of lights outside a window at night. Just before we arrived, he said, without looking at me, that he was going to call Becca and Nora and Sylvia and Dot this week. Not to thank them formally, just to... He paused. Just to talk to them. Nora will want to debate something, I said. I figured. Becca will tell you a story about Lisbon that's actually very funny. Okay. Dot will mostly listen, but pay attention to what she says when she does speak. All right, ma'am. And Sylvia takes her coffee black. Don't offer her anything else. She finds it optimistic. He laughed again, more fully this time, and for a moment he sounded like himself at 22, holding his first published piece, hands not quite steady. I looked at the road ahead and felt something settle in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, because he hadn't asked for it, and not exactly pride, because what had happened wasn't something to be proud of. Something more like acknowledgement. He had read his own text on my phone and seen himself clearly, maybe for the first time in a while. That was enough to go on with. The ceremony was long and pleasant, and not particularly relevant to either of us. Afterward, in the lobby, Fletcher Hale found us and shook Dominic's hand and said something about the Takach collaboration that was diplomatic and genuine in equal measure. He shook my hand too. He said he understood I had been central to the resolution of a complicated situation. I just made some calls, I said. He gave me a look that suggested he understood exactly what kind of calls, and that he was choosing not to examine the architecture of them too closely, which was probably wise. On the drive back, Dominic asked if the Marginalia Club was meeting next Tuesday. "We are," I said. "At yours?" "At Nora's." "Can I mean, not to intrude, but could I bring something? Wine or—" "No," I said, with a smile in my voice. "It's a closed meeting. We have a book to discuss." "Right." A pause. "Next time, though, if you're at yours—" "Next time at mine," I said, "you can make the lamb stew." He laughed, and that was the end of it. Not entirely. These things don't end cleanly. They settle into the fabric of a relationship and become part of the texture of it, something you feel when you press on it, something that changes the way weight is distributed. But for that drive, in that car, with the city going past in the dark, it was enough. 6 months later, I have the corrected article on my desk. It has both names on it, Takach E and Ren D. Alphabetical, which was the convention, which was correct. Erzsébet Takach received a copy at her home in Budapest. Her daughter sent me a photograph, the two of them, Erzsébet and Katalin, at a kitchen table, the article between them. Erzsébet is small and white-haired, and her expression in the photograph is the expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something ordinary to happen. And it has finally happened, and the ordinariness of it is a considerable relief. I put the photograph on the corkboard above my desk, next to the shelf where the Takach monograph lives. The spine label in my handwriting is starting to fade at the edges, but it's still legible. Small, neat, black ink. The Marginalia Club meets on Tuesday. We are reading a book about the ethics of documentation. Who records things? Who doesn't? Whose records persist and whose disappear? It was Nora's suggestion. No one was surprised. Dot brought wine last week. Good wine, actually, better than we usually have. She set it on the island without comment and went to her usual chair in the corner. Nobody asked why. Nobody needed to. I poured the first glass and looked at the kitchen, at the island, at the chairs, at the overhead light that had been there since I moved in 22 years ago. And I thought about furniture. About what it means to look at something and see only its surface, its placement, its fit with the room as you've decided to imagine it. And what it means to look again. "Your people," I said to the empty kitchen before everyone arrived. Then the bell rang and I went to the door, and it was Becca, early as always, already talking, and the evening began.